She never saw it coming. None of them did. It was still early, May 19th, 1836. The sun had just begun to rise over the Texas prairie, casting golden light on the quiet log walls of Fort Parker. Inside, children yawned and rubbed their eyes. Mothers stirred pots for breakfast. Fathers checked rifles and fed the livestock. It was a normal morning, ordinary, peaceful, until the riders came, dozens of them. Some wore war paint, some wore Spanish uniforms. Others came with rifles slung across their backs and bows in hand. They were Comanche, Caddo, Kiowa, and Wichita, warriors united for one purpose, and they rode hard. At first, the settlers weren't afraid. The Parkers had dealt with native tribes before. Just weeks earlier, they'd spoken to a Comanche chief who assured them there would be peace. No raids, no bloodshed, but peace was a fragile thing on the Texas frontier. And promises meant little when the buffalo were gone, and the land was being taken. The attack came fast. A scream broke the stillness. Gunfire followed. Arrows flew over the stockade. Horses shrieked. Men shouted. Then the front gates burst open, and everything descended into chaos. Children ran for cover. Women clutched babies and dove for shelter. The men tried to fight, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded. In minutes, the Fort Parker settlement, a hopeful dream carved out of the Texas wilderness, became a killing ground. But in the chaos, some survived, and one little girl would vanish into legend. Her name was Cynthia Ann Parker, and her story, one of captivity, identity, and loss, would haunt the American frontier for generations. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand the Parkers. They were no ordinary family. Elder John Parker was a Revolutionary War veteran, a hard man with hard beliefs. He was also a Baptist preacher, a man of deep faith, deep pride, and deep ambition. After moving his family across the Appalachian frontier, he eventually arrived in Texas, then a part of Mexico. Like many Americans lured by promises of free land, Parker staked his claim along the Navasota River in East Texas. With him came his extended family, sons, daughters, their spouses, and their children. Together, they built a fortified settlement, Fort Parker. Thick log walls, lookout towers, barricaded gates. It wasn't just a homestead, it was a statement, a declaration that they were there to stay. But they built it on contested land, Comanche territory, and although tensions had simmered for years, they boiled over in 1836, when Texas declared independence from Mexico. To many Comanche, the Anglo settlers weren't just trespassers. They were conquerors, raiders, thieves. So a coalition of warriors did what they believed necessary. They attacked. Inside Fort Parker that morning, blood soaked the dirt. John Parker, now elderly, was one of the first to fall. Despite his age, he'd tried to negotiate. He walked out with a white flag, but the warriors weren't there to talk. They cut him down, stripped him, scalped him. His wife, Sally, was spared, barely. Covered in blood, she crawled into the woods and eventually escaped. Others weren't so lucky. Silas Parker, John's son, was killed defending his home. His wife, Lucy, tried to flee with their children. She was caught. Two of her children, Cynthia Ann, just 9 years old, and her younger brother, John Richard, were taken alive. So was another boy, James Pratt Plummer, and a young woman named Rachel Plummer, who was heavily pregnant. Their fate was now tied to the will of their captors, and the world they entered was nothing like the one they had left. For the next 24 years, Cynthia Ann Parker lived as a Comanche. She was renamed Nadwa, someone found. At first, she was a captive, but slowly, something shifted. She learned their language, adopted their customs, wore their clothes, rode their horses. She didn't just survive. She became Comanche, and she wasn't alone. The Comanche often adopted captives, especially children. It wasn't kindness exactly. It was practicality, replacement. a way to bolster their numbers as war and disease took their toll. But some of those captives didn't just adjust, they embraced it. By the time she was a teenager, Nadwa had all but forgotten her old life. She married a respected Comanche chief, Peta Nocona. Together they had children. One of them, a boy named Quanah, would grow up to become one of the most famous Comanche leaders in history. But Cynthia wouldn't live to see that legacy fulfilled. Back in Anglo, Texas, the story of Fort Parker had become a symbol, a tragedy, yes, but also a justification. The massacre was used to rally settlers, to frame the native tribes as savages, to push for military campaigns, to demand vengeance. Few cared to ask what drove the tribes to violence. Fewer still understood what had been lost, or what had been taken. Over the years, rumors persisted. Some said Cynthia was still alive, living among the Comanche. Others said she'd married, had children, disappeared. But it wasn't until 1860, 24 years after her capture, that the truth came out. A group of Texas Rangers, along with U.S. cavalry, attacked a Comanche camp along the Pease River. It was a brutal ambush. Bodies littered the ground. The Comanche were scattered. In the aftermath, soldiers found a blue-eyed woman with a baby in her arms. She didn't speak English, but her skin was pale, her eyes familiar. It was Cynthia Ann Parker. She didn't recognize her name. She didn't understand why they were taking her. She fought them, screamed, tried to flee. They called it a rescue. But it felt more like a second kidnapping. Back in white society, Cynthia was treated like a curiosity. Newspapers wrote about her ordeal. She was paraded before officials. People expected gratitude, obedience, assimilation. But Cynthia didn't want to be there. Her husband, Peta Nocona, was likely dead, killed in the same raid. Her sons were gone. Her daughter, Prairie Flower, was the only piece of her old life she had left. And even that wouldn't last. Prairie Flower died of illness just a few years later. Cynthia never recovered. She stopped eating, spoke little, refused to wear white woman's clothes. In 1871, she died in Anderson County, Texas. Her death certificate said malnutrition, but those who knew her said she died of heartbreak. She had been Comanche. She had been Nadwa, and the world that took her didn't know what to do with her grief. The story of the Fort Parker massacre wasn't just about violence. It was about identity, about what happens when cultures collide, when nations are built on contested land, when children are caught between two worlds, and neither one will claim them fully. Cynthia Ann Parker became a symbol, not of tragedy alone, but of transformation. She was a girl raised in one culture who found belonging in another, and then was torn from it again. Her son, Quanah Parker, would go on to lead the Comanche through their final years of freedom and their surrender. He became a bridge between two worlds, a warrior who wore feathers and rode horses, but also spoke with presidents and posed for photographs. In his home, he kept portraits of both his white grandfather and his Comanche ancestors. A living paradox, just like his mother. Today, Fort Parker is a historical site, a quiet patch of land in Limestone County, Texas. There's a replica of the fort, a few plaques, a graveyard. It looks peaceful. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of a morning that began in peace and ended in fire, of a family torn apart, of a little girl who became a ghost, and of a country that still doesn't know what to do with the truth. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.